Little Toddler dies, returns with a shocking message about family love. My name is Leo, and even though many years have passed, the memories from when I was very, very small, just a little past my 3rd birthday, are not like wisps of smoke or faded photographs. They are etched into the deepest part of me, vibrant and alive, like a secret garden I can always return to. Back then, my world was a wondrous place, measured in the height of my dad's knees, the warmth of my mom's hugs, and the exciting, unpredictable adventures that could be found in our own backyard. We lived in a house with a squeaky blue front door, and a big sycamore tree outside my bedroom window, its leaves whispering stories to me at night. My faith, if you could call it that at such a tender age, was a simple, uncomplicated thing. It was the feeling of safety when Mom sang lullabies about angels watching over me, the quiet awe I felt looking at the sparkly stars. Dad would point out on clear nights, telling me they were like diamond dust scattered by a kind, invisible hand. I knew there was a loving presence, someone who made the flowers grow and the kittens soft, someone who listened when I whispered my very important 3-year-old secrets into my teddy bear's ear. It wasn't a faith learned from books or sermons. It was a faith felt in the sunshine on my face, in the taste of a juicy strawberry, in the comforting rhythm of my family's love. My family was my universe. There was Mom, whose laughter was like wind chimes, and whose hands always knew how to make a bumped knee feel better. There was Dad, my giant, my hero, who could swing me up so high I felt like I could touch the clouds, and whose deep voice reading bedtime stories was the safest sound in the world. And there was my older sister Mia, who sometimes teased me, but would also fiercely protect me from imaginary monsters and share her cookies, even the ones with the most sprinkles. Love, in our house, wasn't a word spoken as much as it was a current that flowed through everything, an invisible web that held us all together, warm and secure. I didn't question it. I simply lived in it, breathed it, like the air itself. Life was a series of small, delightful discoveries, the fuzziness of a caterpillar, the surprising coldness of a puddle after a spring rain, the way Mia could make funny faces that made milk shoot out my nose. I didn't know then that life could hold shadows, that sometimes the sun could hide behind very dark clouds. My understanding of the world was one of inherent goodness, of unwavering safety, a trust that Mom and Dad could fix anything, that love was a shield that nothing could penetrate. That particular spring, the world outside was bursting with new life. The sycamore tree was covered in fresh, bright green leaves, the crocuses were pushing their purple heads through the still cool earth, and the air was filled with the cheerful chirping of birds building their nests. I remember feeling a particular surge of excitement because my birthday was just around the corner, and Mia had been whispering about a big surprise. Life felt like a perfectly wrapped gift, just waiting to be opened with joyous anticipation. There was no premonition, no hint of the storm that was gathering just beyond the horizon of my innocent understanding, a storm that would briefly, terrifyingly, snatch me away from everything I knew and loved, and then return me, forever changed, with a message I was too young to fully articulate but too profoundly touched to ever forget. A message about the very fabric of family love, a message that I now understand was a precious, sacred glimpse into the heart of eternity itself, given to a little boy who was about to journey to the edge of life and beyond. The texture of those early days was woven with the simple, profound magic that only a very young child, deeply loved and secure, can truly experience. My world revolved around the immediate and the sensory. The rough bark of the sycamore against my palms as I attempted, with Dad's steadying hand, to climb its lower branches, the sweet, sticky juice of a watermelon slice dripping down my chin on a hot afternoon, the comforting weight of our old tabby cat, Marmalade, purring contentedly on my lap as Mom read a story. These were the anchors of my reality, the unquestioned constants that defined my existence. My concept of a being upstairs was less about a specific deity with a long white beard, as sometimes depicted in the picture books Mia had outgrown, and more about an all-encompassing feeling of benevolent presence. It was the warmth in Mom's smile, the strength in Dad's arms, the shared giggle with Mia when we were being particularly silly. This presence was everywhere, in everything good and kind. It was the inherent lovingness of the universe as I experienced it through the prism of my family's devotion. Mia, being older by 5 years, was my first teacher, my first tormentor, and my fiercest ally. She taught me how to build magnificent wobbly block towers that inevitably crashed down in delightful chaos. She also knew exactly which ticklish spot would reduce me to helpless giggles, and she wasn't shy about using that knowledge. But if any other child on the playground even looked at me sideways, Mia would transform into a pint-sized lioness, her small hands on her hips, her voice surprisingly firm. Our love was a complex, dynamic dance of rivalry and fierce loyalty, a microcosm of the larger family love that enveloped us. The rhythm of our days was predictable and comforting. Breakfast together, Dad heading off to work with a kiss for Mom and a ruffle of my hair, playtime in the backyard or at the little neighborhood park, lunchtime sandwiches cut into fun shapes by Mom, afternoon naps, which I was beginning to resist with all the stubbornness a 3-year-old could muster, and then the joyful anticipation of Dad's return in the evening. Dinner was a time for sharing stories, for laughter, for the simple, profound connection that happens when a family gathers around a table, sharing not just food, but their lives. Bedtime was a sacred ritual, a warm bath, pajamas, teeth brushing, always a slight battle of wills, and then the best part, story time. Dad's voice, deep and resonant, would bring to life tales of brave knights, talking animals, and faraway magical lands. Mom's lullabies, soft and sweet, were like a gentle hand stroking me to sleep, promising safety and sweet dreams. It was in these moments, cocooned in their love, that my simple faith felt most real, most tangible. The surprise Mia had been whispering about for my upcoming birthday turned out to be a much-longed-for puppy, a fluffy, wriggly golden retriever pup we eventually named Sunshine. The sheer, unadulterated joy of that revelation, the feel of that warm, soft fur and a tiny wet nose nudging my hand, is a memory that still shines with an almost unbearable brightness. Sunshine became an integral part of our family love, a furry, four-legged embodiment of joy and unconditional affection. It felt as if our family circle, already so warm and complete, had simply expanded to lovingly embrace one more beloved member. There was no hint then, no shadow of foreboding, that this idyllic, sun-drenched world, so full of simple pleasures and unwavering love, was poised on the brink of a terrifying interruption. My 3-year-old understanding of life and death was rudimentary at best, gleaned from the occasional wilting flower in Mom's garden or a cartoon character dramatically, and always temporarily, disappearing. Death was an abstract concept, something that happened to other people, in other places, certainly not something that could ever touch my golden, protected world, my loving, invincible family. The love I felt, the love I received, was so powerful, so all-encompassing, that it seemed to create an impenetrable shield around us, a fortress of warmth and safety that nothing, surely, could ever breach. How could I have known then that this very love, the love that defined my entire existence, was about to be tested, and then revealed, in a way so profound, so cosmic, that it would forever alter my understanding of what family, what love, what life itself truly means? The journey I was about to embark upon would take me far beyond the familiar comfort of Maple Street, beyond the loving antechamber of my family, into the very heart of love itself. The days leading up to what I now call my big sleep were, in my memory, filled with an almost heightened sense of ordinary joy, as if life were trying to pack in as much sunshine as possible before an unexpected eclipse. I remember chasing butterflies in the backyard with Mia, her laughter mixing with mine as we tumbled onto the soft grass. I remember Dad teaching me how to almost tie my shoelaces, his big, patient hands guiding my clumsy little fingers, the scent of his aftershave a comforting, familiar aroma. Mom had been baking, and the house was filled with the sweet, warm smell of cinnamon and apples. These are the small, precious details that often get lost in the shuffle of years, but for me, they are like tiny, luminous pearls strung together on the thread of what was about to happen. The shift was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A little less energy from my usual boisterous games with Sunshine, who, despite his puppy clumsiness, usually couldn't keep up with my 3-year-old whirlwind energy. A nap that stretched longer than usual. Mum finding me curled up deeply asleep in my toy box, a place I'd never napped before. She would touch her cool hand to my forehead more frequently, her brow furrowed with a slight, almost invisible frown that I, with a child's intuition for the emotional weather of my caregivers, still registered. I didn't feel sick in the way I understood it, like when I had a scratchy throat from too much shouting or a runny nose that Mia would dramatically declare was icky. This was different. A quiet, insidious stealing of my usual inner spark, like someone was slowly, stealthily turning down a dimmer switch inside me, making the vibrant colors of my world seem a little less bright, a little more muted. Then came the fever. It crept up on me like a stealthy, unwelcome cat in the night. First a little persistent warmth that made me kick off my blankets, then a more insistent, consuming heat that made my cheeks flush a bright, unnatural red and my eyes feel heavy, gritty, and strangely sensitive to the light. Mom's almost invisible frown deepened into a visible line of concern between her eyebrows, and Dad's usual playful teasing became softer, more subdued, his strong hands gentler than ever as he lifted me. I remember being bundled up in my favorite soft blue blanket, the one with the faded yellow ducks, even though the spring air outside my window was mild and fragrant with the scent of blooming lilacs. The world, through my increasingly feverish eyes, started to take on a slightly shimmery, unreal, almost hallucinatory quality, like looking through a pane of old, warped glass on a very rainy day, or like the wobbly air above a hot road in summer. Familiar objects in my room, my beloved teddy bear, Barnaby, the colorful mobile of smiling planets still hanging above my bed from my babyhood, the cheerful, hand-painted wooden animals on my toy shelf, began to look strangely distorted, their edges fuzzy and indistinct. The kind, reassuring Dr. Peterson, who usually only appeared for routine checkups or the occasional ear infection, came to our house, a rare and therefore somewhat alarming occurrence that signaled to me, even in my fevered state, that this was more serious than a common childhood cold. I remember him sitting on the edge of my bed, his familiar crinkly eyes now filled with a deep, professional seriousness, as he listened intently to my chest with his cold, slightly intimidating stethoscope, its metal disc surprisingly chilly against my hot skin. He asked Mom and Dad lots of questions in a low, calm voice, and then he gently examined me, his touch firm but kind. Afterward, I heard him speaking to my parents in hushed, serious tones in the hallway just outside my bedroom door. I couldn't make out the specific words he was using, those big, confusing grown-up medical terms, but the cadence of their voices, the hushed, almost whispered urgency, the palpable undercurrent of barely suppressed fear, filled my little, overheated body with a vague, formless, yet deeply unsettling anxiety. Things seemed to escalate very quickly after that visit. The fever, which had already been high, spiked even higher, pushing me into a realm of dizzying heat and profound disorientation. A strange, frightening, almost boneless weakness settled deep into my limbs, a lassitude so complete that I felt like a floppy, discarded rag doll, utterly unable to muster the energy to even lift my head from the damp pillow. The beloved, familiar faces of my parents, my anchors in the storm, began to swim in and out of sharp focus, their loving voices sounding distant and strangely echoey, as if they were calling to me from the other end of a very long, dark tunnel. The cozy, comforting familiarity of my own little bedroom, my safe haven, started to feel strangely confining, almost oppressive. The playful, friendly shadows on the wall cast by my trusty animal-shaped nightlight, shadows that Mia and I had often turned into characters in our imaginative bedtime stories, no longer seemed friendly or amusing, but vaguely, unsettlingly menacing in my fever-altered perception. I remember a particularly terrifying moment when I tried with all my might to call out for Mom, to tell her how scared and strange I felt, but my voice, when it finally emerged, was just a tiny, hoarse, almost inaudible whisper, and immediately afterward, a wave of dizziness so intense, so overwhelming, washed over me that the whole room, the whole world, seemed to spin violently, uncontrollably, like a crazy, out-of-control fairground carousel. Panic, a raw, primal, existential fear I had never experienced before in my short, sheltered life, clutched with icy fingers at my small, rapidly beating heart. It was the terrifying, visceral fear of losing control, of dissolving into nothingness, of disappearing completely into the overwhelming, disorienting, and intensely unpleasant physical sensations that were engulfing my tiny, struggling body. My parents' dear faces, when I could momentarily focus on them through the swirling mists of fever and fear, were etched with a profound, almost unbearable terror that mirrored and amplified my own. Though they tried with all their parental might, with every fiber of their loving beings, to hide it from me, to soothe me with soft, reassuring words, with gentle, cooling touches, with desperate, loving kisses on my hot forehead. But their fear, their anguish, their dawning despair was a palpable, almost tangible thing in the room, a cold, invisible current swirling beneath the surface of their forced calm, and it seeped into my already frightened little soul, intensifying my own distress 100-fold. The difficult, agonizing decision was made, I later learned, after a fraught, whispered consultation between Dr. Peterson and my parents, to rush me immediately to the nearest hospital, a place of unknown terrors for a child as young as I. I remember being carefully, tenderly lifted into Dad's strong, trembling arms, my heavy head lolling weakly against his broad, familiar shoulder, the comforting, unique scent of his favorite old sweater, a mixture of wood smoke, coffee, and pure dadness, a small, precious island of olfactory comfort in a vast, churning, terrifying sea of overwhelming fear, physical misery, and profound, disorienting confusion. The frantic journey in the family car is now just a fragmented, disjointed memory of blurry, streaking streetlights seen through the rain-streaked car window, the urgent, insistent hum of the engine straining as Dad drove faster than he ever normally would, and my precious mother's beloved voice, soft, tremulous, and laced with unshed tears, whispering fervent, desperate, almost continuous prayers for my safety, for my healing, for my very life, right beside me in the back seat, her cool hand resting gently, lovingly, almost reverently on my burning forehead. The hospital emergency room, when we finally, screechingly arrived, was a shocking, terrifying cacophony of incredibly bright, almost painfully harsh, glaring lights, a bewildering symphony of strange, urgent, beeping, whirring, hissing sounds from unseen medical machines, and a confusing, overwhelming blur of unfamiliar, serious, masked faces in stark white coats and pale green or blue scrubs, all moving with a speed and an intensity that was utterly terrifying and completely alien to a very sick, very feverish, very frightened 3-year-old little boy. I felt a sharp, unexpected needle prick my arm, followed by a strange, spreading cold sensation, and then, almost immediately, a growing, welcome sense of profound detachment, as if I were gently, peacefully floating away from my own suffering body, away from the overwhelming fear, away from the consuming pain, away from the chaos of the emergency room. The urgent voices around me, shouting medical jargon I couldn't understand, grew fainter, softer, more distant. The glaring hospital lights seemed to dim, to recede, to soften into a gentle, hazy blur. My mom was holding my hand. I vaguely remember the sensation of her loving grip, a desperate, loving anchor in the rapidly receding storm of my earthly consciousness. But even that precious connection felt as if it was slipping away, as if I were drifting further and further and further away from her, from everyone, from everything I had ever known and loved. There was a distinct, undeniable, yet somehow not unpleasant sensation of falling, not a frightening physical fall through space, but more like a gentle, spiraling, peaceful descent into a deep, dark, quiet, welcoming place, a place of profound rest and release. The very last thing I remember from that earthly realm, the final, fleeting image imprinted on my fading consciousness before everything dissolved was seeing my precious mother's beloved face, her beautiful eyes wide with a love so profound, so pure, so unconditional, and a fear so deep, so agonizing, so utterly soul-shattering, that it seared itself with an almost unbearable intensity into my eternal memory. And then, with a sudden, yet somehow gentle, finality, the world, the light, the sounds, the pain, the fear, everything just winked out, like a tiny candle flame being tenderly, irrevocably extinguished by a soft, invisible breath. And I, little Leo, was plunged into a profound, timeless silence, a deep, welcoming darkness, so complete, so absolute, so utterly peaceful, that it felt, in that moment, not like an ending but like a strangely comforting, long-awaited, eternal beginning. The darkness was not like the ordinary, familiar darkness of a closed, unlit room at night, nor was it the comforting, enveloping darkness of deep, restorative sleep. This was an entirely different kind of darkness, a unique, spiritual void, so profound, so utterly, completely empty of all sensory input, that it seemed to absorb, to negate, all light, all sound, all sensation, all thought. For a timeless, measureless moment, or perhaps an eternity, for concepts of time and duration, had utterly ceased to have any meaning or relevance there. There was nothing but this infinite, silent, motionless, featureless blackness. I wasn't scared or distressed in that initial absolute void. I wasn't anything at all, really. It was a complete cessation of conscious being, a temporary, peaceful erasure of Leo, the little 3-year-old boy, with all his nascent personality, his budding memories, his simple joys, and his recent, overwhelming fears. Then, slowly, subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, like the very first, faint, tentative stirrings of new life, deep within a dormant seed after a long, cold, barren winter, an awareness began to gently, quietly flicker into being. It wasn't coherent thought, not yet, not in any way I would have recognized from my earthly experience. It was more like a tiny, primordial spark of pure, unadulterated self, a single, focused point of disembodied consciousness, suddenly, miraculously, realizing its own distinct, individual existence in the very midst of an otherwise undifferentiated, infinite nothingness. I was. That simple, yet profoundly, unimaginably significant, two-word realization was the very first, crucial step back from the terrifying, beckoning abyss of utter annihilation. With this dawning, fragile, yet persistent self-awareness came a strange, new, entirely non-physical sensation, a feeling of incredible, almost unbelievable lightness, of effortless, joyful buoyancy. I was no longer falling, no longer dissolving into the void, no longer ceasing to be. I was peacefully, serenely, wonderfully floating. And then, with a sudden, joyful rush of new perception, I could perceive again. Not with physical eyes, of course, for I clearly, consciously had no physical body in that realm, but with a different, more direct, more encompassing kind of spiritual sight, a pure, intuitive, soul-level perception. Below me, if the earthly concept of below even had any true, meaningful relevance or application in that non-spatial, spiritual place, I saw a scene unfolding with a strange, almost ethereal, dreamlike clarity. Yet it was simultaneously more real, more vivid, more intensely present than any dream I had ever had. It was a stark, brightly lit, sterile hospital room, identical to the one I had just left, or so it seemed. There were several people in pale blue and green medical scrubs, moving with an air of urgent, focused, almost desperate intensity around a small, raised, metal-framed bed. And in that bed, heartbreakingly still, lay a very small, very pale, seemingly lifeless little boy. His usually vibrant dark curls were matted damply against his unnaturally white forehead, and a tiny, clear, plastic oxygen mask covered his still nose and mouth. It was me. my little earthly shell. My recently vacated physical form. My parents, my beloved mom and dad, were there too, huddled closely, desperately together just outside the immediate, intense circle of frantic medical activity, their dear faces a heartbreaking, almost unbearable tableau of profound, soul-shattering anguish and fragile, flickering, desperate hope. Mom was clutching tightly onto Dad's strong arm, her whole body trembling uncontrollably, her anguished eyes fixed with an almost unbearable intensity on my small, still, unresponsive form in the bed. Silent, glistening tears streaming unheeded, unceasingly down her pale, ravaged face. Dad stood ramrod straight beside her, a pillar of attempted strength, but his strong knuckles were bone-white where he gripped Mom's trembling hand in return, his square jaw tight and set, his own kind, loving eyes glistening brightly with a universe of unshed manly tears. And Mia, my brave, precious older sister, was there too, standing a little further back, near the doorway, her usually bright, cheerful little face now buried deeply, protectively in Grandma's comforting, ample embrace, her small, slender shoulders shaking with silent, heartbroken, childish sobs. A powerful, overwhelming wave of pure, unconditional, spiritual love, so immense, so pure, so utterly selfless, washed over my entire disembodied being for them, for my precious, grieving family, a divine love completely unburdened by my own recent physical fear or earthly pain, a love that simply was, in all its purity and intensity. I wanted, with every single fiber of my newly awakened spiritual being, with an urgency that was almost painful in its intensity, to rush to them, to somehow communicate, to lovingly, reassuringly tell them, "Don't cry. Please don't cry. I'm right here. I'm really truly okay. Better than okay." But I had no physical voice with which to call out to them, no tangible arms with which to lovingly embrace them, no way to bridge the sudden vast chasm that now separated my realm of perception from theirs. I was, for that poignant, timeless moment, simply an unseen, unheard spiritual observer, a silent, loving, ethereal witness to their profound, heart-wrenching, earthly grief. A strange, almost shocking, yet deeply comforting spiritual calmness, a peace that truly surpassed all earthly understanding, gently, lovingly settled over my entire spiritual being. The raw, visceral terror I had so recently, so overwhelmingly felt as my fragile earthly life had seemed to be slipping inexorably away, was now completely, miraculously gone, entirely replaced by this profound, unshakable, divine peace, a sense of serene, observant detachment that was not cold or uncaring in any way, but rather imbued with a deep, loving, almost wise understanding. I felt no residual pain, no lingering physical weakness from the raging fever that had brought me to this pass. I simply was, light, free, and wonderfully, peacefully aware. The familiar, yet now strangely distant, sounds of the busy hospital room, the urgent, low, professional voices of the doctors and nurses discussing my critical condition, the rhythmic, monotonous, yet somehow reassuring beeping of the various medical monitors tracking my failing vital signs, my precious mother's soft, heartbroken, almost continuous sobs, all these earthly sounds began to slowly, gradually fade, not as if they were simply getting quieter in sheer volume, but more as if my own spiritual awareness was gently, subtly, purposefully shifting its focus, like a sensitive radio dial being carefully, lovingly turned away from one chaotic, sorrowful, earthly station and tuned instead towards another, as yet unknown, but infinitely more harmonious, spiritual frequency. The stark, clinical, brightly lit reality of the bustling hospital room began to progressively recede from my perception, the bright, utilitarian lights dimming, the sharp, defined edges of the medical equipment and the people around my bed softening into a gentle, hazy blur. I then felt again that gentle, almost imperceptible, yet entirely irresistible, spiritual pulling sensation, not a forceful or frightening physical tug, but more like being carried effortlessly on a soft, loving, invisible current in a vast, quiet, peaceful spiritual river, drawing me slowly, inexorably, yet with infinite tenderness, away from the immediate scene of intense earthly sorrow, away from my beloved grieving earthly family, away from my own still, small, precious physical body that lay so unresponsive in the hospital bed. For one fleeting, human-like moment, a tiny, residual flicker of my earlier, childish fear of the unknown, of separation, tried to reassert itself within my consciousness. Where was I going? What was truly, ultimately happening to me now? Was this the real dying part? But that nascent fear was almost instantly, lovingly, completely subsumed, dissolved by the overwhelming, all-encompassing, divine sense of peace that had so miraculously, so graciously enveloped my entire spiritual being, a profound, unshakable peace that whispered silently, lovingly, directly to my soul of absolute safety, of benevolent, divine guidance, of an infinitely loving, eternal purpose behind this extraordinary, unexpected, and utterly transformative spiritual journey. It felt, with an intuitive certainty that defied all earthly logic, as if an unseen, infinitely gentle, yet infinitely powerful loving hand was now personally, tenderly guiding my little spirit, and I knew, with a profound, joyful conviction that resonated in the deepest, most sacred core of my eternal being, a certainty that came from a place far beyond my limited, 3-year-old earthly intellect, that I was utterly, completely, eternally safe, cherished, and loved. The busy, chaotic hospital room, with all its attendant earthly drama, its medical urgency, and its poignant human sorrow, continued to peacefully, gracefully recede from my spiritual view, becoming progressively smaller and smaller in my perception, like looking at a familiar scene through the wrong, diminishing end of a powerful telescope, until it was just a distant, tiny, fading pinpoint of earthly light in a vast, encroaching, yet somehow not unfriendly, welcoming, spiritual darkness. I found myself gently, peacefully, joyfully moving into a wondrous new space, a realm that was not truly a definable space as I had ever understood or experienced it from my earthly perspective. It was a profound, comforting darkness that was not entirely, absolutely dark, but more like a soft, velvety, incredibly peaceful, pre-dawn twilight, a realm that was immeasurably, indescribably quiet, yet vibrantly, palpably alive, immeasurably, serenely still, yet filled with a dynamic, loving energy. The silence here was vastly different from the terrifying, empty, absolute void I had so briefly, so frighteningly encountered immediately after my physical consciousness had ceased. This new, profound silence was not empty or frightening in any way. Rather, it was a silence that felt incredibly full, richly pregnant, with a palpable, loving anticipation, as if the entire universe, all of creation, were lovingly, reverently holding its collective breath, joyfully, eagerly, patiently waiting for something truly wondrous, something infinitely sacred, something eternally significant, to be lovingly, gloriously revealed to my little, seeking, innocent soul. And then, with a sudden, thrilling, joyful rush of pure, innocent, childlike delight, a recognition that bypassed all thought and went straight to my heart, I realized, with overwhelming gratitude, that I wasn't alone, not at all, in this gentle, beautiful, expectant, spiritual twilight. I couldn't see them clearly at first, not with any kind of distinct, physical-like eyes, for I possessed none in that realm. But I sensed them. I felt their beautiful, loving, radiant presences all around me, like a comforting, protective circle of pure love. They felt like soft, warm, incredibly loving thoughts, like gentle, caressing, spiritual breezes, like the sweetest, most harmonious, unheard melodies. They were, I intuitively understood, beings of pure, selfless, benevolent, loving energy, and their collective presence was filled with an indescribable, overwhelming tenderness, a profound, unconditional, loving familiarity, like the cherished, deeply comforting feeling of grandma's warmest, softest, most enveloping hugs, or like the soothing, magical cadence of mom's most comforting, sleep-inducing lullabies, all magnified 1,000,000 glorious times over. I wasn't in the least bit afraid of these beautiful, loving, unseen beings. On the contrary, I felt an instant, profound, joyful spiritual recognition, a deep, soul-level sense of complete, utter belonging, as if I had finally, wonderfully, miraculously come home to my true, eternal family, a family I had always known, yet had somehow, inexplicably, temporarily forgotten during my brief, earthly sojourn. And then, in the far, far, luminous distance of this soft, welcoming, angel-filled, love-saturated twilight, a new, even more glorious, even more powerful, even more personal light began to slowly, majestically, breathtakingly dawn. It was not the harsh, clinical light of the sterile hospital environment I had just departed, nor was it the ordinary, familiar, comforting light of the earthly sun that had so often warmed my face during playtime in our backyard. No, this was a light unlike anything I had ever seen, anything I could ever have possibly imagined or conceived of in my wildest, most innocent, most hopeful childish dreams. It was beautiful. So incredibly, breathtakingly, heart-stoppingly, soul-satisfyingly beautiful. It started as a tiny, almost imperceptible, yet infinitely brilliant, distant spark, a single glorious, beckoning star in the soft, velvety, spiritual darkness. But it grew with astonishing, purposeful rapidity, blossoming, expanding, radiating an indescribable, soul-penetrating warmth and an irresistible, unconditional, infinite, divine love that reached out with tender, loving tendrils across the vast spiritual distance and lovingly, powerfully, transformatively touched the very core, the very essence of my receptive, grateful, little being, drawing me, with an irresistible, loving magnetism, ever closer, ever deeper, into its glorious, welcoming, all-consuming, divine embrace. It wasn't just a passive light to be seen with spiritual eyes. It was an active, intelligent, loving light to be felt, to be experienced, to be known. A light that was alive, a light that was pure, creative, divine, unconditional love itself. And it was calling to me, little Leo, personally, tenderly, unmistakably by name, though no audible sound was uttered, no earthly word was spoken. Not with mere human words, but with its very divine essence, its very loving being, its very irresistible call to homecoming, drawing me ever forward, lovingly, joyfully inviting me into its glorious, welcoming, all-sufficient, all-consuming, eternal embrace. The gentle, loving, spiritual pulling sensation I had felt earlier, as I had drifted away from my earthly body, now intensified, but it was a joyful, eager, almost ecstatic, blissful pull, a deep, undeniable, soul-felt longing to completely, joyfully, eternally merge with that incredible, beckoning, beautiful, divine light. The last fading vestiges of my earthly awareness, the faint, distant memory of the sterile hospital, the fear-inducing surgery, the overwhelming physical weakness, the poignant sorrow of my grieving family. All these earthly concerns gently, completely, irrevocably dissolved, like ephemeral mist in the brilliant, eternal, loving morning sun as I moved, effortlessly, joyfully, ecstatically, gratefully, towards the most beautiful, most loving, most wonderful, most welcoming light I had ever known, a light that felt, with every fiber of my being, like the very heart, the very essence, the very joyful, eternal reality of home. The light enveloped me, not in a sudden, blinding flash that might have been startling or overwhelming to my tender, childlike spirit, but rather like a slow, infinitely gentle, all-encompassing, loving hug from the very heart of the universe itself. It was profoundly more than just passively seeing light, vastly more than just being physically surrounded by its radiance. I felt, with an almost ecstatic joy, as if I were completely, blissfully immersed in its very living, intelligent, loving substance, as if I had joyfully, gratefully become a tiny, yet infinitely precious and integral particle within its boundless, eternal, loving radiance. And yet, with a beautiful divine paradox that my soul instantly understood and embraced, this magnificent, all-pervading light was also simultaneously, intimately part of me, joyfully, lovingly filling every conceivable nook and cranny of my non-physical, spiritual being, gently, powerfully cleansing, purifying, healing, and renewing me from the deepest core of my essence outward. The last faint, lingering traces of the soft, expectant, angel-filled twilight I had so peacefully, so joyfully traversed only moments before, dissolved completely, utterly, irrevocably, replaced by an indescribable, luminous, multidimensional, eternal brilliance that lovingly, joyfully permeated everything, everywhere, without casting even the faintest hint of a shadow, for it was the source of all true light. This divine, celestial light was indeed synonymous with, an indescribable, soul-satisfying spiritual warmth, a divine warmth that seemed to lovingly, tenderly penetrate to the very core of my immortal soul, instantly, completely healing every unspoken, forgotten hurt from my short, innocent, earthly life, gently, lovingly soothing every hidden, childish fear, powerfully, permanently dissolving every fleeting childish anxiety I had ever, even momentarily, carried within my little heart. It was a divine warmth that silently, lovingly, powerfully whispered to my soul of unconditional, infinite personal love, of absolute, unshakable, eternal safety, of a perfect, joyful, eternal belonging, a homecoming to a state of being my soul had always deeply, profoundly craved, even without consciously knowing it during my earthly sojourn. I felt a pure, untainted, bubbling, ecstatic joy I had never, ever known before, a divine joy that seemed to emanate not from any external source or circumstance, but from the very living center of my own reborn, liberated, spiritual existence, a joy that was my true, essential nature. It was like the purest, most distilled, most innocent essence of the most wonderful Christmas morning imaginable, the most thrilling, delightful surprise of a perfectly planned, love-filled birthday party, and the most idyllic, sun-drenched, carefree, laughter-filled summer day all gloriously, magnificently rolled into one single, perfect, unending, divine experience, yet all of that joy magnified 1,000,000 million joyous times over, and simultaneously, wonderfully infused with an infinitely more profound, more serene, more lasting, more soul-satisfying sense of spiritual well-being, eternal contentment, and utter, blissful fulfillment in His loving presence. The light itself, I perceived with my newly awakened, divinely enhanced spiritual senses, seemed to be intensely, joyfully, consciously alive, intelligent, purposeful, loving, pulsating with a gentle, harmonious, life-giving, cosmic rhythm, like the loving, tender, eternal, all-sustaining heartbeat of the entire vast, multidimensional universe. It was completely filled, utterly saturated, joyfully permeated with a breathtaking spectrum of celestial colors I had never, ever seen before on Earth, nor could I have ever possibly imagined in my most creative childish fantasies. These were hues that were infinitely more vibrant, more luminous, more alive, more multifaceted, more spiritually resonant, and more breathtakingly, exquisitely beautiful than any earthly rainbow I had ever marveled at arching majestically across a freshly washed, sunlit sky after a cleansing summer storm, any delicate, intricately formed flower I had ever admired with innocent wonder in Grandma's lovingly tended garden, any stunning, glorious, divinely painted, multi-hued sunset I had ever witnessed with speechless, childish awe from the familiar comfort of my own little bedroom window. These living, celestial colors joyfully, gracefully shifted and danced with an intelligent, loving, creative grace, constantly, fluidly creating breathtaking, ever-changing, intricate patterns of unimaginable, divine beauty, a celestial, living, interactive kaleidoscope that lovingly, directly spoke to my receptive soul in a silent, universal language of pure, unadulterated joy, perfect, divine harmony, and infinite, unconditional love. And within this glorious celestial symphony of living, intelligent light and vibrant, interactive, heavenly color, there was music, oh, such beautiful music, though it was not music as my limited, 3-year-old earthly ears had ever known it from our family radio or from Mom patiently, lovingly, sometimes a little clumsily, playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or Mary Had a Little Lamb, on our old, slightly out of tune, beloved upright piano in the cozy, familiar living room. No, this divine, celestial music was something far more profound, far more encompassing, far more soul-stirring. It was more like a sublime, multi-dimensional symphony of pure, unadulterated, spiritual feeling, of perfect, divine, cosmic harmony, a silent, internal, yet universe-filling song of ineffable, ecstatic joy, boundless, unconditional love, and profound, unshakable, eternal peace that resonated with indescribable sweetness and power deep within the very core of my awakened spiritual being, lovingly, tenderly, powerfully, making me feel utterly, completely whole, perfectly, infinitely cherished, and wonderfully, gloriously, eternally complete, as if every single scattered, forgotten piece of my eternal, spiritual being had finally, joyfully, miraculously, lovingly come home to its true eternal source. As I floated blissfully, peacefully, joyfully suspended and lovingly, tenderly cradled in this boundless, benevolent, celestial ocean of radiant, living light and pure, unconditional, divine love, I became gradually, yet with increasing, joyful clarity, aware of a specific, focused, intensely personal presence, a distinct, individual, infinitely loving, divine consciousness at the very heart, the very living, beating epicenter of all this incredible, life-giving, celestial radiance. It was as if the entirety of the light itself, in all its unimaginable, breathtaking glory and majestic, loving splendor, was directly, purposefully emanating from this one specific, infinitely loving, all-wise being, or rather, with an even deeper, more accurate understanding, that this divine being was, in very fact, the light, its ultimate, eternal, uncreated source, its most perfect, personal, loving embodiment, its most intimate, tender, and joyfully accessible expression. He was approaching me, or perhaps, with greater precision, it was more accurate to say that I was being gently, lovingly, irresistibly, joyfully drawn ever closer, ever deeper, into the very core of his infinitely loving, radiant being. It was truly difficult to determine the precise mechanics or directionality of it, as all conventional, limiting earthly concepts of linear movement, three-dimensional space, and sequential, temporal distance seemed almost laughably, wonderfully irrelevant, almost entirely meaningless in this sublime, non-physical, multidimensional, spiritual realm of pure, eternal, conscious being. His divine, glorious form was somewhat indistinct, almost lovingly veiled at first, tenderly shrouded within the overwhelming, yet incredibly gentle, tender brilliance of his own luminous, glorious, divine essence. But as he drew nearer to my awareness, or perhaps as my newly awakened, purified, and divinely enhanced spiritual eyes gradually, lovingly adjusted to the sheer, breathtaking, yet never painful, intensity of his divine holy glory, I could begin to clearly, joyfully perceive a definite, beautiful, noble shape, recognizably, wonderfully human-like in its graceful, welcoming, loving outline, yet simultaneously, paradoxically, infinitely more glorious, more perfect, more radiant, more majestic, more loving than any human being I had ever seen on earth, or could ever have possibly conceived of, even in my wildest, most imaginative, most hopeful childhood dreams. He appeared, to my childlike perception, wonderfully tall and infinitely noble, though all earthly, physical concepts of mere physical height and restrictive, three-dimensional dimension seemed utterly, hopelessly inadequate, almost comically inappropriate, to even begin to describe his magnificent, boundless, spiritual stature, his divine, loving immensity. He was robed, it seemed to my spiritual sight, not in any kind of earthly, woven fabric, however fine, but in pure, living, intelligent, conscious light, a flowing, celestial, divine garment that appeared to constantly, gracefully shift and shimmer with every conceivable, unimaginable color of exquisite, breathtaking, heavenly beauty, yet was predominantly, at its very core, a soft, brilliant, incandescent, dazzling, pure white, whiter and brighter by far, infinitely so than the most freshly fallen, untouched, sparkling crystalline snow glinting under the unfiltered brilliance of a clear, crisp, midday winter sun. His face, oh, his beloved, beautiful, radiant, loving face, was utterly, completely, gloriously indescribable, far, far, far beyond the clumsy, pitiful, limited capacity of mere human language, or any earthly artistic representation, however skilled or inspired, to ever adequately, accurately capture, or faithfully convey its divine transcendent beauty, its profound loving wisdom, its infinite gentle soul-piercing tenderness, its perfect holy compassion. It shone with a kindness, a gentleness, a compassion, and a love so profound, so pure, so utterly, overwhelmingly beautiful, that it brought spontaneous, irrepressible tears of pure, unadulterated, grateful, ecstatic joy to my spiritual eyes, though of course I possessed no physical eyes with which to weep in that glorious, non-physical, eternal realm of pure spirit. His eyes, his beautiful, loving, all-knowing eyes, when they tenderly, lovingly, personally met my dazed, wondering, childlike spiritual awareness, were like looking into vast, warm, sparkling, bottomless, infinitely welcoming pools of pure, liquid, unconditional, divine love, pools of light that held no shadows, no judgment, no condemnation, only pure, perfect acceptance and infinite tenderness. They seem to hold within their luminous, loving depths all the accumulated, experiential wisdom of the entire vast universe, all the tender, patient understanding of all timeless eternity itself, yet, miraculously, wonderfully, they were focused entirely, completely, with an almost breathtaking, loving, divine intimacy, on me, little Leo from Maple Street, as if I, in all my childlike simplicity, my profound innocence, my utter insignificance in the grand cosmic scheme of things, were, in that sacred, eternal moment, the most important, the most cherished, the most beloved, the most precious person in all of his vast, magnificent, infinite creation. There was not even a fleeting shadow of judgment in his loving, all-knowing, all-seeing, all-understanding divine gaze, not a hint, not a trace of condemnation or disappointment for my childish misdeeds, my innocent imperfections, my human frailties. There was only an overwhelming, all-encompassing, unconditional, joyful acceptance and a divine, eternal, personal love that knew everything, absolutely everything about me, every fleeting, childish thought, every hidden, unspoken feeling, every secret, innocent childhood hope, every unspoken, terrifying childish fear, and yet, despite knowing all, he loved me anyway. Loved me perfectly, loved me eternally, just as I was, in that very moment, without any need for me to change or to prove myself worthy of his love. I knew then, with a deep, unshakable, soul-deep, joyful certainty, a profound, intuitive, instantaneous knowing that transcended any possible need for laborious, sequential thought or flawed, human logical reasoning, who this magnificent, infinitely loving, gloriously radiant being was. It was Jesus, my loving Savior, the very same Jesus from my mother's gentle, heartfelt bedtime prayers, the same Jesus from the colorful, comforting, reassuring pictures in my first little, treasured children's Bible, the same Jesus whose precious holy name I had so often, so innocently, so trustingly, so hopefully whispered in my simple, sincere, childlike supplications. But he was so much more real, so much more loving, so much more powerful, so much more wonderfully, gloriously, personally present, so much more beautiful, so much more divine than I could ever have possibly imagined or conceived of in my wildest, most hopeful, most faith-filled, innocent childhood dreams. He didn't need to speak. His holy name aloud. My heart, my soul, my entire spiritual being joyfully, ecstatically, lovingly recognized him instantly, with a love that mirrored, however faintly, his own perfect, infinite, unconditional love for me. Awe, so profound, so sacred, so utterly overwhelming, it was almost unbearable, almost painful, in its sheer, blissful, holy intensity, completely, joyfully, gratefully filled my entire expanded spiritual being. I felt an irresistible, spontaneous, joyful, almost gravitational urge to simply be near him, to draw ever closer, to bask forever in the glorious, healing, life-giving, soul-satisfying glow of his infinite, personal, divine love, to rest eternally, safely, peacefully, joyfully in his perfect, all-embracing, divine peace, to simply be with him, in him, forever and ever. He smiled then, a smile so radiant, so loving, so full of pure, unadulterated, divine joy, that the entire universe, it seemed, all of creation, all the stars, all the galaxies, all the angels, all the realms of existence, joyfully, lovingly, harmoniously smiled with him in perfect, glad, resonant accord. It was a smile of pure, divine, creative delight, of tender, intimate, personal welcome, of infinite, gentle, fatherly, loving tenderness, a smile that healed all wounds, banished all fears, fulfilled all longings. Leo, he said, or rather, he lovingly, joyfully, divinely communicated, and his sacred voice, his perfect, spiritual communication, was not an auditory, physical sound that traveled through any restrictive physical medium like earthly air, but rather a beautiful, melodic, internal, spiritual knowing, a direct, clear, unmistakable, heart-to-heart, soul-to-soul divine communion that resonated instantly, lovingly, powerfully, unforgettably in the deepest, most sacred, most receptive chambers of my little, yet eternal, soul. It was clearer, sweeter, more profoundly comforting, more deeply reassuring, more personally loving than any earthly voice I had ever heard or could ever possibly imagine. It was like the most beautiful, celestial, harmonious music, the softest, most loving, most gentle comfort, and the warmest, most secure, most wonderful, most longed-for feeling of true, eternal, joyful home, all perfectly, seamlessly, divinely, wonderfully woven together into one single, perfect, loving, unforgettable divine communication. He knew my name. He knew me. He loved me. And in his presence, I was home.